Yeah. Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this CCF Marine Meetup. A brief intro about MLOM and CCF. MLOM is Marine Life of Mumbai. Most of you attending this may already be familiar with that. It's a citizen-driven open initiative to document the coastal biodiversity of Mumbai. CCF may be a relatively more like unfamiliar name to you. CCF is the formal name of the organization that came out of MLOM, and it's the organization that now backs MLOM and hopes to do associated work around MLOM. Coming to this topic, working with coastal communities, there's a lot of good work that has been happening with coastal communities in India, as some of our guests here will tell you today. But it's a topic that is not touched upon often enough when we discuss about coasts and marine spaces in our country. And it remains a largely secondary aspect of discussions related to the coast. So we're really grateful to the resource persons that have made it here today and have agreed to break it down for us and discuss it with us. We're also very thankful to the audience that's here, and we look forward to your engagement and participation during the following Q&A session. I'll go over a few basic guidelines for Zoom. Please keep your mic on mute and your video turned off. It helps us minimize disturbances. If you have any difficulties with Zoom, or if you have any questions that are not intended for the panelists, please message them privately to either Sarang, Amoli, Sejal, or me. I'm Abhishek. You will find our names as co-hosts at the top of the list. There will be an open Q&A session at the end of this, and that will work through the chat box. The chat box will be made public a few minutes before the Q&A session begins, when you'll be able to message everyone. That's what the option will say. And that's when you can start posting your questions, and our panelists will do their best to answer. And lastly, if we have any tech difficulties with this webinar, we request you to please bear with us while we resolve them and sort them out. Moderating this session with us today, we have Ishaan Khot, and we asked him to do this because we wanted this to be moderated by someone who is familiar with the nuances and the experience of working with coastal communities. Ishaan is a marine biologist. He is broadly interested in human-environment interactions with a focus on fisheries. He's been working with Dakshin Foundation since 2015, where he works on coordinating community-based fisheries management projects in the Lakshadweep Islands. And by doing that, he also works towards making all of us jealous. I'll hand over to Ishaan now, who will take the session ahead, and I'll quietly sit in the audience. Over to you, Ishaan.
Thanks, Abhishek. Am I audible to everyone? Okay, great. Thanks a lot. Thanks everyone for coming. Before we begin, just a very brief introduction to what we're doing here. And even though I can see a lot of familiar names in the audience, I'd really like to emphasize that this session is primarily for people who are not from this field, people who don't necessarily work with coastal communities or coastal ecosystems, but it's meant for people from different walks of life, and is an attempt to sort of reach out to that larger audience. So, you know, keeping that audience in mind, before we begin, I'd just like to set a little bit of a context about what we're doing and why we're doing here. So I guess at the outset, there's two fundamental questions that we would like to address before we move into the panel discussion, and we'll be moving to the panelists shortly. But these questions in my mind are, you know, what do we mean and who do we mean when we speak about, when we say coastal communities? And, you know, the simple answer is that there is no simple answer. And coastal communities are the people that live on the coast. And coast, very broadly, is that zone of interface between the land and the sea. So that region where the land meets the sea. A again, but this is a very simple definition, and there are a lot of nuances to it. You could define communities based on their livelihood, whether they depend on the coast or the oceans for their livelihood. For example, a fishing community, or it could be people who live on the coast, traditionally have been living on the coast, but are currently, engaged in other professions. And there could also be people from coastal communities who are still engaged in tourism operations or things like that. So there's a lot of diversity, and the point of today is not to get bogged down with that, with those details, or get lost in all that nuance, but just to acknowledge that coastal communities does not refer to one homogeneous entity, but is in fact a very diverse group of people with a unique set of challenges. And that brings me to the second question, which is, why are we talking about coastal communities in the first place? So I mean, it's great that a lot of people have come for this, but why are we talking about coastal communities? And then again, it sort of takes me to what I was saying, is that they have a unique set of challenges. And as many of you would probably know, that India has a coastline of more than 7,500 kilometers. And that means that there are people living along this coast, scattered in some places, more concentrated in other places. And the coast is sort of this high excitement zone where there's a lot of things happening. There's a lot of urbanization in some places. There's a lot of developmental work going on in some places. And again, we live in the time of climate change, so a lot of the impacts of climate change are also directly evident on the coast. So the reason we are talking about coastal communities is because these are the communities that are there when all these larger phenomena are at play. And they, in a sense, they are the ones that stand to get affected the most by all these factors, but also have the least say in what's happening. And in that sense, it becomes a marginalized voice. And even literally and geographically, these are people that live on the margins. So I won't say much more at this stage, because we want to bring out some of these points through the rest of the session. So, but I hope that serves as a brief context for this session. And I would like to also to just say that even though there are these nuances and diversity, a lot of diversity when we talk about coastal communities, for the sake of this session, we'll be primarily focusing on fishing communities from different geographies. And that's why all of us have come here today to talk about some of these experiences. And just a quick note on how this session is going to work. We'll be beginning with brief presentations by the three panelists that we have here today. We have really cool panelists who've been doing very exciting work along the Indian coastline with different communities. And we'll be going over to them in a bit. And we'll get to know a little bit about their work, also a little bit about their journey, and why they do what they do. And following that, we'll start the panel discussion, where I'll be asking some questions to each of these panelists based on their work and experiences, and we'll try to get to know a bit more about the larger picture working with coastal communities. Following that, we'll open up the session for the audience Q&A, at which point you can enter your questions in the chat box, and we'll have the panelists answer them. Great. So without further ado, then we'll move to the panelist presentations. And our first presenter for today is Shweta Wagh. I'll just quickly introduce Shweta, and then we can move to the presentation. So Shweta is an urban conservationist. She's also an associate professor at the She has focus on the impacts of coastal policy on fishing communities, in particular the Koli community of Mumbai. So over to you, Shweta.
Yeah, thanks, Ishaan. Yeah, I'll start with my presentation. Um, so I'll be presenting my work with the coastal community in Mumbai. Our community interests are intertwined with nature and ecology, and it's important to understand that communities conceive and value nature differently. Therefore, when we think about conservation, we need to acknowledge various kinds of relations between people and the environment. What is remarkable about the fisher community and what first drew me to this area of research is how the Coastal Regulation Zone, which is the CRZ, a regulation earlier conceived of as an environment protection regulation, was seized and expanded through collective struggles of the coastal fisher communities to protect their livelihood interests. Another interesting aspect is how, in a dense metropolitan city like Mumbai, where development is largely driven by real estate interests, how does a fisher community persist and continue to carry out subsistence and livelihood activities on a narrow strip of land and water which now constitutes the coast? I was also interested in the complexity and coexistence of different worldviews, which include traditional institutions, customary rights, and ways of working with coastal ecosystems. And finally, I was interested in how the fisher folk use, share, and shape this interface between land and water, which constitutes the commons. How different areas of land and water are apportioned by the community for practicing their livelihood activities, ranging from fishing to the parking and docking of boats to casting nets, drying and sorting of fish, or the mending of nets, etc. I first started working with the fisher community around the time when the CRZ 2011 notification was being finalized. And although the CRZ has been substantially diluted since 1991, the 2011 notification provided protection to livelihoods and demanded that settlement areas and land and water commons of the quarries in Mumbai be demarcated. Can we move to the next slide, please? Since then, I've been involved in mapping various types of coastal commons, analyzing impacts of various kinds of infrastructure and development projects on the fisher community. One of the projects that is going to have a significant impact on the cultural and social life of the Koli community is the Coastal Road project. We started writing about the coastal road in 2015, but it was only in 2018 that concern about the project actually began to be felt when the land filling was started by the BMC. The Coastal Road project was justified in various ways by a variety of documents. One part of this justification was the social impact assessment report prepared without any community engagement. It did not recognize nor document artisanal fishers and the traditional fishing zone of Varli Kolivada. It was more concerned with property and argued that since there was no displacement of settlements or impacts on property, there were no social impacts. Due to this lack of any studies or documentation, we undertook a study along with the fisherfolk of Varli and documented various kinds of practices that govern the use of land and water commons. Can I move to the next slide, please? This involved a study of various practices, tools, and techniques, each adapted to specific conditions of the coast. The study led to a writ petition filed by the Kolis in the Mumbai High Court, and the report was also tendered in court. In court, BMC was claiming that and assuming that there was no fishing activity near the shore and that the intertidal zone which was being reclaimed was a barren wasteland. When our report pointed out the existence of intertidal fishing, the High Court then intervened and asked the Fisheries Institute to undertake a study. This study, in fact, ratified some of our findings and acknowledged the presence of shallow water fishing and nearshore fishing in the nearshore and foreshore areas along the coast of Mumbai. So this slide, in fact, shows it's part of our report, which shows some of the documentation that we carried out, where we have tried to show the coast as a zone of transition and also show how various kinds of fishing practices are adapted to different kinds of ecological and geomorphic conditions, such as the depth of water or the kind of rock. And it was quite fascinating to be a part of this experience where the fishers, in fact, shared this knowledge with us. And it's interesting that even the fisheries department or the CMFRI, none of these institutions had documented any of these practices of the coastline of Worli. So in fact, there was no such documentation till we, put out this study. Yeah, I'd like to conclude with this.
Thanks, Shweta. I think some very interesting and also serious points made there. We'll come back to you with more questions during the panel discussion. But for now, let's move to Rahul, and I'll just briefly introduce Rahul here. Rahul Murlidharan is currently pursuing his PhD with the Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and the Environment, that is A3. And he's been working with fishing communities in Tamil Nadu, especially small-scale fishing communities for almost a decade now. And his PhD work focuses on the implications of marine conservation practices, both on wildlife as well as for fishing communities. So let's get to know more about the work that Rahul has been doing from Rahul himself. Over to you, Rahul.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for inviting me to this panel. Just a second, I'll begin my presentation and start talking. Yeah. Can you go to the previous slide? I'm not able to control. Yeah, so actually I'll begin with the story, my story. It all began in 2006 when I was in Madras Christian College. I was pursuing my bachelor's degree, and we had an environmental club called the Scrub Society. So the Scrub Society organizes turtle walks. The turtle walk is something that is very common in Chennai, where we go see turtles when they come to nest between the months of November until March. So that's how I got introduced to marine conservation. But the only difference was that I was spending a lot of time with the fishermen because it was a community-based conservation project. And I got to spend a lot of time with them, and slowly I started staying back in the nights, walking with them, and sometimes going out for fishing in the morning with them. These gave me a lot of opportunities to understand how the small-scale fishermen see turtles or the marine resources in itself. And this kind of experience also slightly started worrying me, because when I joined my master's in marine science, what I was reading in the classroom and what I was seeing in person, it was very different, because the literature that I was reading was framing small-scale fishers in a particular fashion. But my interactions with the people was giving me a different story. So this sort of got me thinking, okay, why this is happening? And also some of the other disturbing news that I was hearing was that whenever a sea turtle was, found dead on the beach, mostly the small-scale fishers were blamed. But I was wondering, how is it possible that we keep on fishing and we increase fish production at the same time we also are trying to do conservation on the coast? So this led me to study humpback dolphins in Chennai. I did a short study for my master's thesis, but I continued my work. I started traveling along the southeast coast of India, mainly Andhra and Tamil Nadu, to understand where humpback dolphins are present and what type of interactions they have with the fishing community, which took me to my field site. My PhD field work happened in the Park Bay and Gulf of Mannar. Can you go to the next slide, please? Yeah, so I was actually thinking, how do I explain my PhD work in 5 minutes or less? So I thought I'd better put up a map so that it's easier to talk about it. So I guess some of you might be familiar with Tamil Nadu. In the map, you can see the Tamil Nadu coastline, and I particularly worked in the Park Bay and Gulf of Mannar, which is in the Ramanathapuram district of Tamil Nadu. It's a very peculiar place. The dolphins, there are the humpback dolphins that I was working on are found here, but they are in conflict. Historically, the humpback dolphins have been in conflict with small-scale fisheries. So I just wanted to understand, okay, what happens in this place, because conservation literature largely frames dolphins, fishing as a threat to dolphin conservation. But here the story was upside down. Here the dolphins were troubling the fishermen, eating the fish from the nets and damaging the catch and causing economic loss. But it just didn't stop with the dolphin. But I wanted to get a larger story of trying to understand how the state does both fisheries development, that is increasing fish production, as well as conservation. And this region provided an ideal site to do that kind of a study. In the map, if you can see Park Bay, so I wish I can show you a map, a better map, which shows the depth of this region, because the Park Bay is a shallow water body between India and Sri Lanka. So the average depth is about 10 meters or so, and it's filled with seagrass beds. It's a beautiful place. In the southern part is the Gulf of Mannar, and the box that you see is the Gulf of Mannar Marine National Park. So there are no clear boundaries, but just for the purpose of representation, I've given this box here. There are a group of 21 islands in small islands in the region, and in 1986, the space was demarcated as a marine protected area. And after that, the small-scale fishing communities living in the region have been increasingly harassed, and also they've been like displaced from their fishing grounds. While I sort of wanted to understand Park Bay from a fisheries point of view and Gulf of Mannar from a conservation point of view, there was also another angle, because this region is an international border region with Sri Lanka, and there's also an angle of security here, and there's also a context of the Sri Lankan Civil War, and Tamil Nadu was heavily involved in the Civil War. So basically, my thesis asks this question: how does the state sort of do conservation development as well as securitization along the same coastline, and what implication it has on the fishing community? So that's that's a brief overview of my thesis. I can talk more about my study site during the panel discussion. Can you go to the next slide? So I'm just going to end here. This slide, I just wanted to sort of signify the transformation of artisanal fisheries. We generally think artisanal fisheries are not, technologically efficient and so on. And when I say small scale or artisanal fisheries, I just wanted to bring a definition here so that I'm clear. When I say small scale fisheries, I mean fishing households, not commercial companies, who use small amount of capital and energy, small fishing vessels, making short trips close to the shore, and they are basically composed of nuclear families. So they're a very small unit of fishing. And this net, the image here shows sardines in monofilament nets. Right now, monofilaments are widely used in small scale fisheries, and this is creating a lot of ecological changes. And the small scale fisheries is also slowly transforming, because now we have more powerful engines and larger boats and bigger fishing gears, which sort of has an implication on the ecology. And given the context of climate change and the decline in fish resources, the future of small scale fisheries is somewhat worrisome. We can discuss more during the panel on some of these points that I've listed here. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Rahul. And also thanks for explaining, the use of certain terms such as small scale fisheries. And I would like to urge all the panelists and including myself that let's try to keep the use of technical terms to a minimal, so that we try to convey the essence behind some of these terms, and if wherever unavoidable, let's try to break it down and explain some of these terms, so that if there are people from the who are outside this field, it'll be easier for them to understand. Great. So moving on to the next panelist, we have Shiba Desor, who's currently a researcher at A3 again. Shiba has had widespread experience working with communities in different parts of India. She's worked with organizations like Kalpavriksh before, also worked with communities in Uttarakhand. More recently, she was also associated with Dakshin Foundation, where she has done a lot of work with the Karan community in the Andaman Islands. And this is again a coastal sea dependent community. And that's what she's going to be talking about more today. And other than that, I don't think Shiba would mind me saying this, but she is an avid believer in the healing power of low art, khichdi, and afternoon naps, as you can see in her bio. She also makes really good puns, depending on how you like your jokes. So over to you, Shiba.
Thanks, Ishaan. So, hi everyone. Let me begin by my story of how my Andaman journey began. Back in 2017, I was in Bangalore for a few days after having spent a long time in a village in Uttarakhand, and thinking that enough now, I will spend some time enjoying the urban pleasures of society. While in Bangalore, I decided to visit a friend who was working in Dakshin, and one thing led to another. And before I knew it, I was in Andaman for the next 2 years. Next slide. Okay. Sorry. Let me see if I can slide. Yeah. So next slide. Andaman's.
Shiba,
Yeah.
Shiba, can you check if you have access to control it?
Let me see.
Because I've given it to you.
For some reason, yeah, 1 second. For some reason, it's not happening. Let me see.
Okay, you want me to switch inside?
Just 1 second. Let me see. Yeah, I think it will happen now. Yeah. So when I went to the islands, I realized that in their minds, there are two distinct categories of a mainlander and an islander, whereas we think sometimes of India as one unit, but we barely ever give thought to Lakshadweep and Andamans. Andamans has a fascinating history, and it has many indigenous communities that have been staying there for tens of thousands of years. But my work was with a settler community called Karen that had settled in Andamans from Burma back in the 1920s. At that point of time, the British were encouraging settlement in the islands because it's easier to control a space when you have more settlement there. In Andaman, it was very easy for the Karen to adapt because they were a forest dependent community that were good in hunting, gathering, shifting cultivation, as well as fishing. They are also great craftsmen of bamboo, wood, and cane. This project began many years ago through conversations between ANET researchers and the Karen people that work with them. And one of the main persons who conceptualized this project is a Karen person who's been crucial in both formulating and executing this project. The photograph is of Soja Nongthong, who's a Karen person working with ANET for the past 20 years. So this project tries to facilitate in articulation of livelihood possibilities for the Karen community that consider ecology and cultural considerations at their own terms. So the approach that we took was to assess the ground situation through a socio-economic survey, oral history, interviews, and conversations at community center. The survey was actually conducted by current people themselves, and even in the oral history interviews, they were involved. In this process of promoting traditional skills and supporting local livelihoods, we used the elders from within the communities as the resource persons and teachers, and we had bamboo craft workshops, weaving and stitching trainings, a nursery for all the medicinal plants, a monthly community market where they would share produce, a small shop to sell the goods, and also eventually a cooperative run local food restaurant. Within all of this, we were trying to reinforce conservation values through nature walks, workshops, and screenings, again involving the local people as also the conductors and facilitators. There was an important role for communication throughout, and this communication was happening through the community markets, through the AKC Facebook page, which helped the Karen within the island to communicate and tell their story to the diaspora of Karen people elsewhere. And also we have been involved in making some posters and booklets of the data that we collected. So as you can see, our approach involves socio-cultural, economic, ecological, these three different aspects of work. These are some pictures. So this is a photograph of the community market. As you can see, there are some handloom products, local fruits and vegetables. The thing on the left bottom is a rice cake made of sticky rice and banana and steamed in a bamboo leaf. Then this is a photograph of the inside of the community center, and you can see them weaving and then using those cloths. These are some of the craft products that we encourage the elder artisans to make again. The ball on the left is called chain, and it's used for playing the traditional sport called chain. There's a cowbell on the right, and then there is a model of the dungi, which is an excellent boat that's used throughout Andamans for fishing and for just simple navigation. We also help facilitate some matches again with this game, which were happening after many, many years. Then these are photographs of the bamboo craft workshops where people learned from an old craftsman how to make a chicken tokri, like a basket. Yeah, this is a photograph of one mangrove walk that they took. And then this last photograph has the restaurant on the bottom left, top left. Then the nursery and the people have also been doing by themselves cleaning drives. So that's that photograph. And the bottom right photograph is of a storytelling session within the community center. Thank you.
Thanks, Shiba. I really want to visit that restaurant at some point.
You should.
Yeah, great. Thanks a lot. And that brings us to the end of the presentations. And we'll begin the panel discussion now. So as you can see that it sort of takes me back to the things that we were discussing during the introduction, is that communities themselves are not homogeneous. And within these three panelists, we've seen that there are different approaches of working and engaging with communities. And also reminds me of a conversation I was having with some friends who work in the corporate sector, and they were genuinely curious and confused about what does social science research entail, or what does it mean when you work with communities. But I hope that these presentations and the kind of PhD work that Rahul is doing, and the kind of issues that people study, I hope that sort of gives some clarity. Did I say something very funny?
Yeah, sorry. One of the participants were.
Yeah, some laughter is always good. Anyway, so but yeah, I hope these three presentations give an overview of the different approaches that one can deal with. So there is research, there is academic research, like the PhD work that Rahul is doing. There is policy and advocacy work, and there is action research that feeds into that advocacy, like the kind of work that Shweta has been doing. And there's also the work that Shiba has been doing with collectives and communities. So I just want to go back to Shiba here, and considering that as you said in your presentation, that people on the mainland are a little disconnected from the islands, right? So the kind of work that you do is a little difficult for. It's not very commonplace for us to imagine. What is it like to say live on an island or work with communities that have so I'd like to know more about what's the like you've described those activities, but what's the larger philosophy or the larger picture behind doing such work?
Thanks, Ishaan. So I think it's about believing that the communities that are living there and that have to face the brunt of whatever happens there also have the capacity to deal with it best if they're given the tools. So instead of thinking of them as targets, to try to go along with them and learn from them and help them facilitate them in handling and tackling the structural violence that's otherwise imposed on these people, as like what Shweta and Rahul mentioned about all the developmental pressures that are there, and sometimes even from conservation that are there, like to help just facilitate that process and eventually make ourselves redundant in the process.
Okay, great. Thanks. And I guess a lot of this is also like some of these interventions are easier to possibly facilitate in islands which are relatively still cut off from, the kind of development pressures that you see on the mainland. And on the mainland, you see, communities more directly and more visibly caught in that whole crossfire between the different pressures. So that takes me to my next question, Rahul, about what you presented and the work that you've been doing. In many conversations that I have with my friends, when I talk about the work that I do, so even though everyone doesn't really know the details or the nuances of the work that we do, that there are people who are pro environment and pro conservation, right? People think that it's a good cause, and even if you're not doing anything about it directly, you might donate to a conservation organization once in a while. But in this larger or in this very broad idea of conservation that people have, communities don't often figure in that whole idea. And the impression that I get when I speak to people is that communities, and especially fishers, are kind of perceived to be antagonistic to the environment, right? So and as if they are the problem, and that's what you said as well, right, with your observations about the dolphins and the small scale fishers. So I'd like to ask you, how true do you think is that? In what contexts is it true? And is it always the case that communities are antagonistic, or can they also be allies in the whole larger vision of conservation? I'd really like to know your thoughts on that.
Thanks for asking this question, Ishaan. I think it's very important, and I think it takes some research also to articulate, these kind of questions. So when I was reviewing literature, conservation literature, there are three things that I found out that identify why small-scale fisheries are destructive. One is the fact that the population is high. Overpopulation leads to overfishing. When I say overfishing, I mean the ability to fish beyond the capacity of the fish population to reproduce. And this has been attributed to small-scale fisheries. The second thing is, small-scale fisheries also is characterized by poverty. So there's a narrative that, since the small-scale fishers are poor, they tend to exploit the environment. And the third thing is, small-scale fisheries use indiscriminate fishing techniques. So from a fisheries policy point of view, these sort of narratives are identified to sort of dismiss small-scale fisheries and push for further industrialization of fisheries. Because here we are talking in terms of efficiency, how much energy that we are putting in and what kind of returns that we get back. And in India, basically, this like our sort of fisheries policy is tied to this narrative that small-scale fisheries are primitive and the fishing practices that they do are wasteful. And that's the reason why the British started the Fisheries Department in 1905. And they wanted to improve the fishing sector. And after the independence, the Indian state felt that, again, the same, it borrowed the colonial ideologies that small-scale fisheries are primitive, and it wanted to develop fisheries to encourage employment and so on. But over time, we realized that that objective has changed to improving foreign exchange and export rather than focusing on the domestic market. But given these facts, there are also other positives of small-scale fisheries, right? Across the globe, 90% of the fishing population engaged in fisheries are small-scale fishing communities. They catch about 50% of the global catch. They use less fuel. Women fish workers are engaged in this sector. There is low capital investment. Bycatch or the unwanted catch of marine species is negligible compared to industrial fisheries. And most of the fish that is caught in small-scale fisheries is for direct human consumption. In contrast with industrial fisheries, which sends these fish for fish meal production and aquaculture. So I'm not saying, having said this, I'm not saying that small-scale fisheries is not destructive, but I think we also need to look at small-scale fisheries from the larger political structures that govern them, right? Right now, for instance, Tamil Nadu is the highest fish-producing state in India, right? And if you see small-scale fisheries contribution is only 2%. So it's mostly industrial and large-scale fisheries that are contributing to the fish catch. So what I'm trying to say is that small-scale fisheries can be destructive in certain cases, but it's always not the case.
Great. Thanks, Rahul. I think that's, that gives us a good historical perspective of also how things came to be the way they are today. And I think that's very important when you try to, when you go about trying to address some of these problems. I think we also got a very good overview of, the role of small-scale fisheries in livelihoods and nutrition, especially in a developing country like India. So, but having said that, and the example that Rahul gave is that how due to some of these larger narratives, these communities often find themselves in the midst of challenges. And that takes me to Shweta, because we've looked at communities in the Andamans and now we've looked at communities in the Park Bay and Tamil Nadu. And I think the kind of pressures that we're talking about only get amplified as you move into a more urbanized and more developed space. And I guess the stakes at play are much higher. So Shweta, according to you and, based on the work that you've been doing with the fisher community of Mumbai, what do you think are some of the key challenges that coastal communities face? And, especially, so we'd like to know specifically from your work as well, and also what you think generally about these challenges.
Right. Right. Yeah. So I think the major challenges that are being faced by the fisher community today, as everybody is maybe well aware, is the threat of relaxation of environmental regulations that have so far protected the livelihoods and resources of these communities. And one sees that there are, I think there is the new dilution in the draft EIA 2020, but also the CRZ has been diluted several times. And it was recently that, just before the Coastal Road project was cleared, given CRZ clearance, there was an amendment to the CRZ which allowed reclamation in coastal areas and the intertidal zone, which until then had not been permissible. So I think it is one needs to understand how sometimes these dilutions are also made for specific projects, but that is going to have long-term repercussions for even other coastal communities, even in rural context and all across the coastline. So I think it's very interesting, and we've been also trying to understand how specific dilutions in environmental policies were made for specific projects, especially urban projects and mega projects. I think another aspect is also this, that these large infrastructure projects and beautification projects, which are also driven by real estate interests. And we see that a lot in Bombay. Or the kind of perception of the fisher community, especially by middle class groups or, certain elite residents who find this activity, the productive activity of fishing itself, to be a nuisance, and the coastal commons themselves as being untidy or undesirable, and therefore there's increasing attempts to shift these productive activities, move these out of cities through commodification of the coastline. So I think that's another aspect. Apart from that, you have problems of pollution and the destruction of environmental resources and estuarine and coastal ecology, which displaces livelihoods, but also results in a decline in traditional practices. So what one sees is that even in South Bombay, the reclamation for the coastal almost entirely destroyed the traditional fishing grounds of the Worli fishermen. And this has also, in a sense, compelled communities to move away from traditional occupations and also move to maybe mechanized or industrial forms of fishing. So I think one sees this kind of transformation, which is a huge challenge that we need to do.
अनम्यूट होता है इधर। हाँ अभी जमादार ऐसे आपका नाम आया है।
Okay. Yes.
पापा को बोलूं बोलने के लिए?
Can we ask everyone to mute themselves? Yes. So thanks, Shweta. I mean, like the picture that we're sort of drawing here with what everyone is saying is that on the one hand, communities get blamed for a lot of things that go wrong with the environment because of their direct interface with the environment. On the other hand, when there are these much larger powers at play, and there's not much that they can do, but in fact how those factors in fact drive changes in their lifestyles, in the way they have been living and associating with the coast. So that sort of takes me to the next phase of this discussion. And so usually when I tell people that I work with communities, the question that I get is that, oh, so do you educate them? So there is this inherent assumption that communities are the ones who are in need of being educated, and so whereas it's sort of like in some of the work that we do, we've seen that some of the interactions that we've had with fishers from different parts of the country reveal that they in fact know so much about their ecosystem and the way way their livelihood and its association with the ecosystem functions, that there's in fact a lot to learn from them. And so I'd like to ask you, Shiba, as like do you see communities as do we really educate communities, or do we learn from them, or or is it a bit of both depending on the context? And considering that most of us on this panel are either researchers or development practitioners, do we at times tend to over romanticize communities and their lifestyles, especially when we work in the islands? And if we do that, what are the pitfalls of that sort of an approach?
Yeah. No, it's a very important question, because yes, I think we end up falling into one of the two things. Either we romanticize them and they are always living in harmony with nature, or we vilify them as poachers or anti-conservation. And I think that even if we feel like we want to educate someone, we have to learn about someone before being able to educate them, to be able to have that baseline data as a researcher. So learning from someone is best done by learning. Yeah, learning about someone is best done by learning from them. So in that way, I feel that just becomes a part of the process. Even if we feel like we have to educate them, even then we have to learn from them first. And anyway, I feel that education in itself is a word that needs to be deleted from our dictionaries, and it has to be more of a mutual process of learning everywhere. And yeah, that's basically it.
Great.
I just wanted to come in here. If it's
Sure.
just, yeah. So I just wanted to ask this basic question: what do we know about the sea, other than what we read in our books and what we see in our videos? Unless and until a person goes on a boat or remains in the sea, they can't understand what the sea entails. And the knowledge that the fishermen have is an experiential knowledge. It's not for we create knowledge to carry our own livelihood, like go to college, teach, and so on. For them, it's a matter of life or death. Therefore, the knowledge that they have is very deep. And if we go as researchers, we are not going to learn anything from them. We should go as students. And by learning, there is a way of co-producing knowledge. I can articulate what I know that I've learned from books and what I've experienced with the fishermen. That's what I try to do in my work, at least. Like somehow bring the knowledge that the fishermen have with my own knowledge and experience, and how I can present it to a general audience and make it more available and palatable.
I think I'd like to add something that for the first time since we stepped on a fishing boat and went off Cleveland Bandar and went to experience the way artisanal fishers work and work with the tides. I think it was remarkable because it just changes the way you see the ocean. Till then we had not really like we were mapping the terrestrial commons and the intertidal commons. We're not really set out into the sea, and I think it just changed everything for us because the way the fisher community works with the tides, have an understanding of seasonal variations, the way they anticipate what kind of fish will be available and where exactly on that rocky shore to cast their net. So I think that kind of understanding is something that can only be experienced. And it's important that at the same time that while we need to document this diversity and support the protection of subsistence practices and protect the rights of traditional fishermen, at the same time I think it's important not to romanticize traditional practices, because even the way they practice fishing today in Mumbai has changed since they were doing it before. So there are certain practices that have changed, but still we would define or classify that fishing as accessible as artisanal, because it's still closer to the shoreline. They are still working with the ecological systems, and it offers many insights in the way in which coastal communities value and share resources. So I think that is something that we really need to understand and learn from these communities.
Yeah, great. I think this is obviously a point where everyone has a lot to say based on their experience, and I completely agree with everything that you guys have been saying so far, and that's also sort of the overarching philosophy of the work that we do at Dakshin as well. And so while we're talking about learning from communities and more broadly working with communities, in addition to all these lessons, what do you guys think are some of the challenges that are inherent? And again, I think all of you should speak about this because each site, you guys are working in very different geographies. Each site has a different context. So what are some of those challenges that you have encountered while trying to work with communities? And also, were you able to overcome those challenges, and what did you do? So who'd like to go first? Shweta, Shiba, Rahul?
Yeah, I can start. I can briefly talk about the challenges that I faced of working in the Parkway and Gulf of Mannar. And also probably add a little bit about the broader challenges, though it's not very exhaustive. So actually, I didn't realize what kind of a place Ramanathapuram in Tamil Nadu was when I started my fieldwork, because it's a nice place. There's like coral reefs and sea grasses, and there's a lot of fish and so on. But the place also had some eerie energy because, again, as I mentioned during my presentation, this is a border zone, right? And there's a history of civil war and so on. And there are so many restrictions to operate in this space. So when I went there initially and interacted with the fishermen, saying I wanted to like stay and work, nobody trusted me, and there were some rumors that I was from the CBCID, that I've come to do some undercover work to see if people are catching any endangered species or so on. And they hate researchers. The small-scale fishermen, they hate people who do conservation research because they think that it's because of people who do conservation research, they're facing all the problems in terms of their access being restricted, in terms of ban on certain species of fish and so on. So I had to make myself clear that I am not here to do pure conservation, but try to understand the lives of fishing communities and see if we can find some solutions by doing that. So it took almost 5 months for me to gain trust and do the kind of research that I did. I basically did an ethnographic study where I stayed in the fishing village for about 18 months doing what the fishermen were doing. I just also wanted to add this point about the romanticization, because before I did field work, I had like these romantic notions. Okay, I'm going to go on the boat, I'm going to go fish and so on. But I was literally turning into an insomniac because the fishers go fishing when the fish moves, and the fish usually moves at around 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. in the Gulf of Mannar. So I lost sleep for a long time, and also they spend a lot of time mending nets after they come back, because we think that fishing stops after they come back to the shore, but here people mend nets for 6 to 7 hours in the sun. And over time I realized it's not so romantic as it's portrayed to be. Unless and until you do it, you might look like a healthy fat fish, but if you are working in a fishing community for a long time, you might become a dry fish.
Okay. Yeah, I'd like to add something that, as
Shweta, are you going next?
Okay. Yeah, so basically often our research engagements, end up being short-term, fleeting, often driven by project funding or timelines. And often when researchers, they engage with communities, they do it for info or data for their own academic work. And that's how most academic research works. But I think it's important to emphasize and think about long-term relationships with people and, of research also as a way of advancing environmental and social justice. So where the researcher is part of a larger collective struggle rather than simply as a collector for information. So that is something I strongly feel.
Yeah,
Yes.
I would like to add that as both of them said, yeah, as both of them said, in-depth research, in-depth fieldwork is the way to go, and that requires you to completely immerse yourself in the place. But you can still never be one with the community, because you always come to that place with your own privilege, and there will always be a sense of otherness that will be there between you and the community. So to live with that and to also like accept that and figure out ways to overcome it in a little, but like accept the fact that it will never be completely overcome. And there can also be, like, if you're doing in-depth research for long term, there can also be a sense of isolation that develops, because you are, as you would know from all the years of work in Lakshadweep, it can get too much. So having something that you do, which is, because work and leisure boundaries are very confusing in a place like the field. So still having something that you do as a routine that's just for yourself can keep you sane.
Okay, I'm having some bandwidth issues, so I'm just putting my video off. Thanks, Shiba. Thanks everybody for sharing that. I think I just have one last question, and then we move to the we'll open up the questions from the audience. So considering like what we've discussed till now, what do you guys think? I mean, we've discussed the challenges that we might face, or we discussed the challenges that communities face, and that is the larger that is the scenario in which we are working, right? So in each of your respective areas of work, what do you see as the future? How do things look? What are the optimistic things, and what are the not so good things? So again, would you like to go in the same order?
Yeah, sure. So what I'm trying to say here is not exhaustive, as I mentioned, but what I see as the future of small-scale fisheries is that, as we know, the small-scale fisheries is transforming, and there has been a steady decline of fish catch, right? Like from the 1950s, research shows that there is a steady decline in fish catch, and particularly in nearshore areas where the small-scale fishermen operate, or fisherwomen or so. There was a question from somebody about the fisheries policy right now, which has come, which encourages aquaculture. So we are going to see both technological as well as spatial transformation in fisheries. So the rationale that the state uses to push for aquaculture or deep sea fishing is that the nearshore fisheries are depleted, and therefore we need to move offshore. And therefore, tuna fisheries are promoted right now in terms of deep sea fishing. And the nearshore areas are planned to be appropriated for mariculture. Mariculture is something that happens in sea, in cages, in nearshore areas. Basically, the small-scale fishermen are operating independently right now, because the occupation is independent. I don't have to depend on a boss or anybody. I'm my own boss, and I catch fish and I sell and I take for my personal consumption. So in the situation where mariculture might expand, we can see that there'll be the artisanal fishers or the small-scale fishers might be made as labor to operate in this region, because the spaces that they've operated in traditionally might be diverted for other such purposes. And also, given the fact that fish catch has been declining, there's a general push for aquaculture. So aquaculture has its own societal as well as environmental effects, which I'm not going to develop here. So given the fact that there is going to be a fish catch decline, there is also a problem of employment generation. If the next generation of fishing community, they are being sent to school and they study and so on. Some people remain in fishing, which is good, but the community has its own aspirations. And we need to make sure that certain employment opportunities are generated for this particular group of people. As well as, I also foresee a lot of health impacts given the context of climate change. Now, as fish catch declines and the consumption of fish reduces, which is a cheap animal protein that small-scale fishing communities can access, they might have to depend on other resources, which might have some effects on the nutritional intake in the community. I'll stop here.
Thanks, Rahul. I mean, there's really a lot that one can say here. So, I mean, we'll just quickly get thoughts from the other two panelists. Shweta?
Yeah, I would just like to add one point, and that is related to climate change, which is going to make coastal landscapes increasingly vulnerable. And unless there is action both to alert and address both the causes and consequences of climate change, I think it's going to be very difficult both for the communities, as the settlements of communities are vulnerable, and so are their livelihood areas and practices.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's going to be the big game changer in the years to come, in a way. I mean, it's going to change our perceptions about a lot of things the way they are. Yeah, Shiba?
Yeah, so in Andamans, for instance, there's a great push right now for high-end tourism, calling it high-end low-impact tourism. But if you see that in most of these cases, the authors take against the small-scale fishermen and farmer. So, like, the future can be manipulated and fixed or changed a bit, I suppose, if we create more spaces for questioning. So if we can do that, if we can create spaces for positive articulations and like consciousness, awareness, but at the same time, that space for resistance through giving them the tools, I think that there is still a chance.
Right. Okay, great. I think we've got some very interesting thoughts here, and that brings us to the end of the panel discussion. And we've already got a lot of questions from the audience, so let's move to them right away. So I'm just going to scroll through the chat box and read out some of these questions. Those that are kind of repetitive or have been covered in what the panelists have said, in the interest of time, we'll try to skip them, but you can always email these questions to the panelists as well. So also, if I miss out on any of the questions, organizers, please point it out to me, please. All right, the first question that I see here is from Nivedita Bansal. If conservation discourse is repackaged as development discourse, does it really matter if the end goal stays the same? I think, Shweta, this would be an apt question for you. What do you think?
Yeah, but I think one needs to define what one means by development, right? Because even today, if you look at the way the MCGM or our government authorities are packaging the development discourse, it is like a conservation discourse. They are talking about planting Miyawaki forests on the reclaimed land of the coastal road. They're talking about building underground reservoirs to solve the waterlogging and flooding issues in the city. So I think the way or for instance, eco concrete for the of the coastal road will help in the preservation of marine biodiversity. So I think there are all these mitigation measures and greenwashing techniques which are aimed to make development more palatable. But I think one needs to really question that. But I think it is true that a lot of the new restructuring and infrastructure projects in cities are packaged as conservation or environmental improvement projects.
Right. So unless we break down the meaning of those terms to see their actual implications, just repackaging the discourse wouldn't help. In fact, that might actually be more detrimental.
Yeah, in fact, it's already happening. You see this kind of packaging.
Exactly. All right. So wherever there are repeat questions from the same people, we'll first move to people who haven't asked a question yet. So I'm moving to a question from Ankita. Fishing communities have always been at the mercy of local governments and other authorities. Where do you see a compromise between them? Also, do you see the coastal and water commons playing a role in reclaiming the community's autonomy, perhaps, or rather facilitating a codependency between state and fishing communities? Any takers? Rahul?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that the fishing community has always been at the mercy of the local government, because there are instances where the fishing community itself has taken certain initiatives, and we have examples from the Coromandel coast. Because when we say local government or authority, we are actually meaning post-independence. Before independence, it was the community itself that was managing its resources and so on. So there are these traditional village panchayats, at least in Tamil Nadu, that help in managing resources. And in fact, the first regulation for trawling came from Tamil Nadu in 1976 in the Park Bay, where the local community went to the government authorities asking them to impose a ban on trawling. So in a way, the state itself has not been forthcoming in deciding certain regulations, but it's been from the community. The community has actively participated and voiced its views against the destruction of fisheries as well as the common spaces that they've depended on for many centuries. So the second question is, do you see coastal and water commons playing a role in reclaiming communities' autonomy? So I think in terms of the legal claims, it's the sea sort of confuses everything. It's not like land, so therefore there was no boundaries that could be drawn. For example, the first 12 nautical miles is under the control of the state. For India, there's an exclusive economic zone. From 12 nautical miles to 200 nautical miles, it comes under the Indian territorial waters, and beyond that is high seas. So any form of community management happens within the state zones. And I guess these questions of commons and so on are complicated a little bit in the marine context, given other forms of development and conservation pressures that happen in this region. I'm not sure if I've explained this well enough, but I would like Shiba or Shweta to explain that.
Yeah, I'd like to add something here. So basically, the coastal commons, or are resources which are valued and shared by the community. So they're collectively managed and governed. And in recent times, the state, the way this state has been operating is increasingly trying to enclose the commons and appropriate them, not just through large-scale mega projects, but also through initiatives where people, certain people in the community who have moved away from fishing and towards real estate interests are also trying to privatize common land. So I think it is important that the community, the people who are still dependent on these commons, are somehow claim and maintain access and also claim their right to use these areas, because I think the whole idea of commodification is something that is prevalent, and the state is playing a large role in trying to commodify or privatize the commons.
Right. Next question is from Sarah. Small-scale fishing communities face an array of hardships in India. How can the contribution of small-scale fisheries be increased towards poverty alleviation and food security in India? So again, more SSF related. Shweta, Rahul, would you guys like to take this?
I think this sort of questions, takes us back to 1950s or so, when the intention of the state was to increase fish production so that it can feed a hungry population. And therefore, the state justified certain forms of development interventions, which is, of course, the mechanization of fisheries. And it also encouraged small-scale fisheries to take up these sort of capital-intensive forms of fisheries. But it clearly shows that these sort of development interventions have not, really reduced poverty or improved food security, because the focus of fisheries policy, at least in India, is to increase production as well as increase foreign exchange. So it's very confusing, because research shows that the catch is steadily declining in India, but the fishery statistics that comes every year shows that the catch is steadily declining. Increasing. This means that there is increase in the production. There's more intensification of fisheries, and not only wild catch, but aquaculture and capture fisheries are also contributing to this. Despite all these development interventions, 60% of the small scale fishers in Tamil Nadu are below poverty line. And the issues of malnutrition, as well as the questions of food security still linger because of, again, the larger political economic structures that govern these interactions, where there's more focus on exports rather than domestic markets and domestic consumption.
Right. So an increase in production does not necessarily mean an increase in or does not equate to poverty alleviation, because there are so many other factors at play there, essentially.
Yeah. So the fact is also that the earnings that come through fishing is concentrated to a particular population. It doesn't trickle down to the small scale fishing sector as such, due to various factors.
Correct. So I'm just going to scroll down till the end of this chat. There is one question for Shiba. In Andaman, Havelock is the most well-known island for tourism. In a way, most of the people across the world look at Andaman from the specs of Havelock, also known as Swarajdeep. But while I was there for approximately 6 months, I saw very less representation of community culture. Also, current people there are more involved in the industry of scuba dive, which is also related to marine biodiversity. So why has your work also done on that island?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, generally, could you talk about the culture and especially what's the scene in Havelock and the currents?
Yeah, no, so it's a very relevant question in the sense that that was the objective, that people can be proud of their own culture and be able to use that for their livelihoods. But it's a very tricky thing, because sometimes it just becomes then objectified and marketed too quickly, and then it becomes in itself a problem with a lot of competition coming in, and all the elements of sustainability and ethics going out of the window. So it's very important to take these processes slowly. So that is the eventual idea, that people can take pride in their own culture. For that, they need reaffirmation of their culture. Right now, what they're usually being told is that whatever they do connected to fish, it smells like it's fermented, like some of the foods that they make. Then, like, there is a sort of shame sometimes associated with small scale livelihoods, which has to be slowly eroded, and it takes time. It takes a very long process to do that. So it's very easy to have these like small livelihood interventions where you're just selling a few things, but to be able to get into the consciousness of the people there and let it be their own solutions is going to be a long-term process. Yes, we don't have that much time, but there is no other way of going about it. Another point about the scuba diving people, yes, we are trying to also train, or actually they have more knowledge than us in terms of the local biodiversity and everything, and they are expert divers. So just like give them a few tools to be the guides there, but to be able to do nature guiding and environment education, things like that, with the like for tourists and for the people living there in a more gentler manner. So that is basically the idea but as I said, it has to be a slow process.
Right. And I think one of the next questions partially ties into some of the earlier things, like what you said about that shame associated with involving oneself in these fishing activities. And there's a question from Shiv Shankar about will the upcoming generation of communities of small scale fisheries think about fishing unlike the shift that is being seen in the agriculture? I think this has partially come up in some of the things that you guys have said, but is there a quick response? Shweta, from the Koli community, what's your experience been?
So I think There is in some many cases we do see a tendency for the younger generation to move away from fishing, especially in urban metropolitan cities, and those are evidences that we find. But at the same time, in our work with the artisanal fishers of Wagh, we realized that most of the fishers were from the younger generation. They were also interested in continuing these practices. They, in fact, did not want to transition to commercial fishing or trawling. And in fact, most of the people who filed the writ petition were also, from the younger generation within the Kolivada and Worli. So I think one sees both aspects, and I think it's also dependent on which part of the community you're talking about. Like if you look at Bombay, again, the Kolivadas are not homogeneous. Many of the fishers, especially in Kolivadas like Versova, where due to pollution activities, creek fishing has almost declined. You do see a lot of transition of fishers who were earlier artisanal fishers to trawling, and then slowly also into real estate, where there is this whole process of enclosing and commodifying the common lands. And I think on the other hand, we see within every Kolivada, we see that there is a certain percentage of fishers who are artisanal fishers, and they are still wanting to continue with their traditional activities. So I think we see both aspects. Like we see a shift, but at the same time we see a struggle to retain access to their livelihoods.
I would like to add.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so I think it also sometimes depends upon the changing scenario. Like for instance, with in Andamans, with this heavy dependence upon tourism for livelihoods, but with COVID coming in and there being a complete lockdown, suddenly a lot of people who were working in Havelock have moved back into the villages and are going back to fishing and farming a lot more, because when you fish, at least you can feed yourself. So there are always these scenarios sometimes that can make you shift, like help in a paradigm shift. And I think that in some ways, maybe COVID can be one of those scenarios where people may either think about, oh, let's do more subsistence fishing, or because of there have also been a lot of negative impacts on fishers during the COVID time. So it could also go the other way.
Right. I mean, that's something that we've kind of seen a little bit in Lakshadweep as well, where generally you see the trend of people moving away, but we also see people who've studied outside on the mainland, but they come back and there are no jobs for a lot of educated people, but they make a lot more money by fishing. And so we do know some of these youngsters who are very happy to be fishing there. So we see both sides of that sort of argument. There's one question from, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd just like to add that it's a very lucrative activity. So unlike when, the imagination that the intertidal zone is barren and, you only get some prawns and crustaceans there. We in fact were engaging with the Worli fishers, and they said that they actually get lobsters, they get gold, they get ravas, they get quality fish there, and which is of high commercial value. So a lot of people realize that it's just so easy for them to just, step down from the Worli promenade and catch lobsters. And, that's, as a livelihood option, it is really attractive to a large part of that community, rather than, which is why there's so much of a struggle to save what's left.
Absolutely. There's a question from Daniel Lewis, but I think we're going to touch upon that a little bit at the end. So I'm going to the next question from Dhanya. I'm from the background of public space management studies. During a participatory action research in fishing community in Chennai, I was told that women have self-help groups and cooperatives and play an important role in the sales and value addition of catch. They are not directly involved in decision making. Is this true? And if so, how can a post-COVID future better integrate needs and inputs of women in coastal management? I think this is the subject for a talk in itself, but is there I guess there's a lot to explore there and talk about, but any quick responses?
That's a good question. Of course, women have self-help groups, but at least in Tamil Nadu, at least along the Coromandel coast, there's a village panchayat which is primarily male-dominated, and there's not much scope for the women to participate. But it varies in the southern portion of Tamil Nadu. So it is true that some of the self-help groups do not have much agency in decision making. But generally, the women fish workers suffer a lot right now because of first of all, the decline in fish catch, and there is increasing competition with male intermediaries, because traditionally post-harvest sector was taken care of by the women, but right now buying and selling fish is also a lucrative business opportunity. There is a lot of knowledge and advertisement that seafood is better than eating meat and so on. So there's generally an increase in consumption of seafood, and therefore there are new players that are entering into the post-harvest sector. So there's a struggle there for the women. I think there should be some sort of a policy level change to bring in the voices of women fish workers into decision making. And unless and until that is being done, it's very difficult to sort of include their voices. That's what I would see in my point of view.
Right. Shiba, Shweta, anything to add on this particular point?
I think the women in Bombay, especially the ones who are involved in the selling of fish, they're quite organized and in fact very vocal about their interests. So I think they do play a role in kind of ensuring that their rights are preserved. In fact, we also see these kinds of struggles or organized struggles by women to prevent this kind of commodification. And so for example, in Warsaw recently, there was a whole struggle by the women to prevent their land being kind of sold to builders, so community land and village land. So I'm saying that it's true that at least in Bombay, from my experience, the women do play a very active role, are a part of even the political leadership.
Yeah, and sometimes policies can make a difference. For instance, there was one policy where motorcycles were being promoted for selling fish. So, and motorcycles are usually, it's more, in our society, it's been more men who ride motorcycles than the women who would otherwise be the ones who sell the fish. So, like that, how we frame our policies, how gender sensitive we are in our policies can also make a difference in the post-COVID future.
That's right. So we have another question from one of the viewers who's catching this session on YouTube live. But again, I think that's something that we'll try to address at the end. We have question from Mr. Jamadar, Vanchit Machimar Haji Ali, and so there's a question here that there's a comment about we are registered fishers and here to operate from Lotus Jetty, Worli, Mumbai, and reclamation for coastal road is reaching Lotus Jetty to cover all the open area using force to vacant it. And I think, Shweta, that's something that you've been very closely associated with. So is there a, would you like to comment on this, just for the, for the wider audience to get to know what's happening here? Because it's a very critical issue of our time and it's ongoing right now.
Yeah, so I think they have gone ahead with, so I think last year the High Court quashed the CRZ clearance and the environmental clearance, CRZ clearance for the project, and also said that the BMC would have to go and get an environmental clearance and conduct a mandatory public hearing. But the BMC and the project contractors then filed an SLP in the Supreme Court which was heard in December. The Supreme Court stayed the High Court order and allowed reclamation work to go on. So for the past almost more than 6 months since December, work has been continuing. It has been continuing even during the COVID lockdown. So instead of focusing on essential services or pre-monsoon services, as they called it, they continued with coastal road reclamation under the guise of pre-monsoon, essential work. And they are, so I think more than, I mean, I've heard from some of the local fishermen that quite a lot, a significant amount has already been reclaimed, in violation of the CRZ clearance. And the final hearing the matter will finally be heard in the Supreme Court starting next Monday. So I think we are all waiting for that outcome. Yeah, but in the meantime, reclamation continues, and it's a blatant violation of all the environmental clearances.
Correct. Thanks, Shweta. So, Shiba, I'm going to direct this question from you. I've scrolled up a little bit to, because now I think we have repeat questions from most of the audience. So there's again one question about indigenous knowledge and how robust is indigenous knowledge of fisheries, considering how quickly the marine landscape is changing because of climate change and human activities. And I think, even if it's not specifically about fisheries, I think this is something that's happening to all systems. So from your experience working with communities and indigenous knowledge, what do you think?
So, a knowledge is robust if it's resilient, if it can face the challenges and be able to respond to them quickly. And indigenous knowledge, if it's not robust or if it's threatened right now, it's not because of climate change. It's because of the internal threats in terms of how it's not appreciated, it's not accepted, how everything that we are taught in education, in schools, all these communities, what they're taught is taking them away from that. And even like when you lose the practice, as you're saying, if a lot of people stop doing those practices that they used to do, then again you lose it. So indigenous knowledge could be robust if it was practiced, if it was kept alive and dynamic in terms of being respected and appreciated in the present life. So it will be different in different places. In some places it will be robust and be able to adapt, I feel, if it's there. If it is there, if it exists, then it will be robust. But in most cases, it's fading. It's just like the last.
Shiva, I think your audio was a little unclear towards the end.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah,
so basically, like I was concluding by saying that it simply depends upon the thriving atmosphere, the nurturing atmosphere that the indigenous knowledge is getting or not getting. If it's getting an atmosphere that's eroding it, then it will not be able to respond to climate change. So climate change is not the threat. The other threats to the knowledge are the threat that will make it less resilient.
Okay. So there's one. Sorry, Shweta, did you want to add something there?
Yeah, I feel that indigenous knowledge and, especially these traditional artisanal practice are very important from the point of view of, the environmental crises that we are facing, in a sense that they help in preserving biodiversity. So in a sense, they need to be safeguarded. But what, like as Shiba saying, what we see increasingly is that, the kind of justification that the government produces for mega projects also requires documentation. And so it's surprising that so many of the government institutions are producing knowledge, but in a sense they also then justify its destruction and say that that this can be compensated. And the way the documentation then takes place is almost for the purpose of computing how much compensation, how can you monetarily compensate for the loss that is suffered if this is lost. So there are no efforts that we see to in fact attempt to safeguard these knowledges or even preserve them. And that's something that we increasingly see in Bombay, because most of the studies that are done are for just the sake of justifying projects. So the knowledge is being produced for the wrong purpose.
Right. Rahul, anything from you from the Park Bay community, and what's your experience been with the indigenous knowledge of the communities?
So I think, as I mentioned before, these people have been, living and working in this region for a long time. And I think in my case, I guess indigenous knowledge is more for resistance, because in terms of the marine protected area, the state claims that in case the fishers are allowed to go and fish in the islands, then they'll destroy the coral reefs. But people make claims that they've been here for several generations, like their fathers and their forefathers and their grandfathers. Everybody has fished there. They exactly know where there are coral reefs and where there are other sort of ecologically sensitive ecosystems. And they make sure that they don't destroy it, because their future catch depends on these ecosystems. And oftentimes they say that, people who don't have any idea of the sea or what fishing means are in a position of power. It can be like a wildlife warden in the forest department, or an additional director or deputy director in fisheries, and they sort of come up with these ideas and impose on the fishing community. So I have seen instances where indigenous knowledge is used as a form of resistance against other dominant forms of knowledge that affect the fishing community.
Right. What Shiba said actually took me to one example from Minicoy Island, which is the southernmost island from Lakshadweep, and they had this indigenous calendar which they call the Nakai, and where they divide the entire year into distinct periods based on the season and the weather, all of those things, and so it's, and each of these periods is called a Nakai, and based on that, they're able to kind of predict how the harvest is going to be, which is a good season to go fishing, what kind of fish you get in which season. But with the impacts of climate change being more and more visible, the effectiveness of that calendar has sort of been reduced, because things aren't as steady climate wise as they used to be, because the rainfall is very unpredictable. There's a lot of unpredicted cyclones, and the incidence of cyclones has increased so much. So that makes it very difficult for them to refer to that calendar and draw any inferences. So that's one example where a larger force such as climate change is trying to make these kind of predictions difficult. And in order for it to be resilient, I think also because some of this is old knowledge and it's not, nobody's working on it currently. There are no recent adaptations of that. So, and once the larger climatic patterns start to change, the efficacy of that tool is sort of lost. So that's some of the stuff that we came across in the work that we're trying to do with documenting indigenous knowledge as well. Just thought I'll jump in here and say that. There's one question for Shweta again. The fact, it kind of says the same thing again. The fact of sea level rise and intensified cyclones and weather phenomena is usually evident, yet architects are suggesting projects like Coastal Road. Is it the ignorance of the architects or arrogance of politicians? Why do we have proposals for such projects? I think it's a very philosophical question, but I think very important at the same time.
Yeah, so I'd like to answer this question by just referring to, I was invited to speak at a conference earlier this year. It was on, making Mumbai a resilient city, and so it was organized by Bombay First, and it had all the, World Bank and all the funding institutions are there, and basically also a lot of government people. Praveen Pardesi spoke at that conference, so it was in a sense a lot of bureaucrats and politicians and architects, NGOs, and basically looking at how to now make Mumbai a resilient city. But what was interesting in that conference is that there was no reference to either coastal ecology or communities or livelihoods. In a sense, the entire emphasis was more about infrastructure, heavy engineering and technological interventions, and how that would help us make, help us adapt to climate change, etc. There was also a lot of discussion on finance and financing and funding for climate adaptation. So that was something which was very interesting. So in a sense, the justification that Praveen Pardesi gave in that conference was that he said that the coastal road is in fact a sea wall that will protect the city from climate change and, in case of sea level rise. And he also said that, in fact, there were other presentations which also argued that, in fact, the large-scale reclamation of land will make climate adaptation, which is the coastal road, more financially viable, because, you need to finance. So reclamation would, in a sense, create value to finance such projects. So I think it's very interesting to see how skewed our government priorities are. There is so much emphasis on mega projects and technological fixes, and one realizes that it's more about economics than about ecology.
Right. Great. I think we've been able to address most of the questions that we've had here. There are some comments towards the end. I'm just going to quickly read out, and if any of you have something to add to that, please do. So there is one comment here. Yes, I don't think that the young generation in coastal fisherfolk community is moving away from traditional fishing. Instead, moving from fishing in their villages, they become migrants to travel to other harbors to join in to trawling and other mechanized fishing. Here, they have been facing more exploitation by the boat owners and discrimination by the local community. Still, lack of resources and union coalition is a problem for mobilization in the community. I think that's a very important comment, and that's something that I think most of us within the panelists and the organizers have been associated with some sort of COVID response work over the past few months, and one of the key things that we saw is the plight of the migrant fishers. So I guess again, like for the benefit of the larger audiences, does somebody want to briefly talk about migration within fishing communities?
Okay, so I can come in here briefly. This is a very important point that has been raised. So small-scale fishing is quite seasonal, and therefore during off seasons, people tend to find other forms of employment, and generally they depend on the mechanized trawlers for livelihoods. Not just India, within India they move. For instance, in Tamil Nadu from Ramanathapuram and Kanyakumari, people go to work in Dubai or Bahrain or some other Middle East countries for 6 months to operate there and make some money. Yes, definitely the labor, that small scale fishing labor that moves from their own villages to trawling centers face exploitation, and in a way they are pretty much an unorganized community. But again, there is also a problem of organizing this migrant community, because the boat owners don't want such form of organizations to evolve, because mechanized fishing basically depends on exploitation of labor, because that exploitation is what is accrued as profits by the mechanized fishing industries or the owners. So therefore, they don't want this kind of a union to be forming, and therefore it's a very informal sort of a group of people right now. And as Ishaan pointed out, the COVID scenario has shown the effects of migrant labor, and from where all they come and work in fisheries, and not just the fishing community, but in terms of in Ramanathapuram, for instance, it's a drought-prone region, and many people from the agrarian communities have also come into fishing, because here they don't need skills to predict fish and so on. There are equipments that show where the fish are and so on. basically they're employed as laborers, daily wage laborers, who make some money and then they go back. And I don't think they have any agency in unionizing themselves to protest against exploitation or so on.
Right. So, Rahul, I'd just like to go back to something that you said a little earlier about aquaculture and the kind of impacts that might have for small scale fisheries. So, we actually got a pretty elaborate question on email before the session, and I'm just I'll just quickly read it out. And if we could try to briefly address it here, and after that we'll move to closing comments, and we'll conclude this session for now. So so there is this thing about India releasing its draft mariculture policy, and the policy draft also calls for marine spatial planning. And we know that aquaculture is now a $7 billion export industry with the introduction of exotic Pacific white shrimp species. And the government has also planned to invest 20,000 crores in the next 5 years in fisheries and aquaculture. But pretty much most of the money would be diverted for mariculture and aquaculture compared to capture fisheries. And even with the setting up of ministry at the center, I would argue that this was done for allocating sufficient funds for the aquaculture. So I think it's quite long, but just like, I think the essence of this is that there are researches to show that mariculture can be planned in a way that it doesn't come into conflict with fisheries and even the shipping industry, purely because of the amount of space available on the sea. I think that is the question. Are there researches to show that mariculture can be planned in a way where it doesn't, sort of pose a conflict to small scale fisheries or other occupations on the coast?
Yeah, in a way, many things can be planned in a better way. Even in terms of marine protected areas, for instance, it can be planned in a better way. But it does not necessarily happen in a way that it is planned and it is practiced the same way. So, of course, I agree with the statement that most of the funds is allocated for the aquaculture sector. Which is also true in some cases, because even the large exporting seafood industries feel that there's more certainty when it comes to aquaculture. Because, for instance, if I am sourcing seafood from small villages, I need to operate like a vehicle that will go pick up seafood from everywhere. Whereas an aquaculture park will be a one-stop shop for me. And I don't have to also think about whether I'll get the catch or not. So aquaculture improves the certainty of getting the seafood. But with the question of marine spatial planning, though it sounds good on paper that mariculture can be planned in a better way that does not exploit the small scale fishing, or it can be made. There are ways to sort of space out mariculture and the shipping routes and so on. We need to also see where these mariculture is ideal, because you need a particular temperature, you need a particular depth to install these cages. And I'm sure that it will, in a tropical developing country like India, I'm sure that the ideas for mariculture will hinder the small scale fishing communities. And these are all speculations. Unless and until these come up, and given our past experiences, we can predict that these might cause a lot of changes in how the small scale fishing communities function. But unless and until we see them coming, it's very difficult to say how they can be planned better.
Right. I think there are no easy answers there, and to most of the questions that have been asked today. But I think that's the most important thing to understand about these problems, that they are in fact very complex. So there's this one last category of questions which are more focused on careers and what people can do. So I think let's club this. Let all the panelists address this, and let's club it as two things. One is a little bit about how to become a professional in this space, whether it's conservation or working with communities. So there's a question that explicitly says that what would the panelists recommend I study, and what are the career prospects in India and abroad? There are other related questions which I skipped initially, but they're trying to understand, even if people are not actively involved in this profession, what else can they do to either further the cause of conservation, or to know more about communities, or to learn more about conservation. As closing remarks, could all of you sort of take this question? And before I forget, we also had a webinar on careers in marine biology a few weeks back, a couple of months back, I think, and that video is recorded and it's up on the YouTube channel of Marine Life of Mumbai. So anyone who's more interested in knowing about that, and that session was a more specific career-centric session. So do pay a visit to that channel and check out the video. Great. So Shiba, can we start from you?
Yeah, sure. So I would say that if you want to work with communities, do not go with the idea of being a change maker or saving anyone, something of that sort. I think that just go to learn and to observe, initially at least. Find a rooted small organization or space, or like some other way of like just being there, but like without also the danger of romanticizing that, oh, I'm going to learn from them, but just observe the pressures that a community faces, and be there, help them in whatever they want to do, based upon what they are asking you, but at the same time keep your analytical thing on that. And the other thing about communicating our research to people, for our work, we had a Facebook page, which was which has been a good channel for communication. And within the idea was not that much to display and to talk about it outside, as much it was to, at least for that time, build the capacities within. So the focus was to have those dialogues and conversations within the local landscape, and they would go for fairs and exhibitions nearby to show their things, rather than like it becoming something in national or international right away.
Yeah, Shweta?
Yeah, I think I think I come from a different background. I'm not a marine biologist. I'm an architect and urban conservationist, but my interest was in ecology, and so I managed to somehow kind of step across these disciplinary boundaries, and now I'm engaged with ethnographic work with the fisher community. So I think I would just say that you should just do what you love to do, and your work in fact will change you. So it's important that eventually I think you find something that is you are actually interested and engaged with, and becomes a priority.
Yeah, I think that's a very key point. I think for people who are asking career related questions, is that don't limit yourself to these disciplinary boundaries. And in fact, there's a lot of room for people from a very diverse academic and work experience backgrounds, and all of them have a lot to contribute towards conservation and sustainability. Yeah, sorry, Rahul.
Yeah, I think I guess reading would be a good place to start, because there's literature that's available out there about fisheries or conservation or whatever you'd like to get in. Through reading, one also develops empathy, right? Because we understand the pressures of the community and so on. And it also sort of brings this critical ideas to us. Like, we question the assumptions that we have so far. For instance, if we remember our schools, whenever a class was noisy, the teacher would come in and say, what is this? This resembles a fish market. So, where are these ideas coming from? I think through reading and through talking to people who have experienced or learned these things, one can develop critical insights and the power of questioning, and that helps if we are doing research or if we are approaching the community from that perspective. I think it also helps to communicate what really happens, and we are not basing our knowledge on assumptions that somebody has already given us.
Right. Great. So I guess that brings us to the end of the question and answer session as well. Thanks a lot, everyone who's stayed with us till now. So in conclusion, I think I'm just going to say that, this is not a subject that's easy to cover in such a short span of time. And, what we've done today is a little bit of scratching the surface. But that was the objective from the start, that, we are not going to get into a lot of details. But if this session has sort of helped create a little bit of more awareness about the kind of challenges that communities face, and what's that larger picture, and the dynamics at play, and if it gives the audience a little more food for thought, then I guess that's what we were hoping for. So I hope that's kind of achieved through this session, but feel free to share your feedback with us as well. And I think some links are being displayed here now. So things that you can particularly do and check. So even if you're not directly a part of this field, what are the things that you can do to, keep yourself aware, and, as a conscious and aware citizen, what are those things that you can keep track of that are going around you? So please do follow all these handles on social media, and, ask more questions. Great. So that's it from me. Thanks a lot, guys. Over to you, Abhishek.
I think Ishaan has covered most of the closing remarks. I just wanted to tell you about the links that are posted in the chat, which the panelists have offered, links that were relevant to the discussions today. And to sum up, I would just say that this is a really broad and complex topic, but the panelists here have done a very good job of breaking it down and discussing it. I myself have learned a lot. I'm sure everyone attending has. And Ishaan, you've done a spectacular job of holding this together and bringing so many diverse questions and diverse views all into one webinar by moderating it. So thanks a lot for that. We will be having more of these in the future, so stay tuned for that. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. See you.
Thank you. Thanks to the wonderful team at CCF and Marine Life of Mumbai for providing this platform. Great.
Thank
you,
you.
guys.
Bye. Stay safe.